The whole town said the old cedar was cursed, that anyone who touched it would never sleep right again. But a lonely veteran in a red and black flannel jacket didn't believe in ghost stories. He just wanted firewood and a quiet winter with his loyal German shepherd by his side. Then the dog froze, snarled at the empty air, and the tree began to bleed. What fell out wasn't wood, but a metal box that had been screaming to be found for 40 years. Inside it waited a secret that would tear open the past, expose a hidden monster, and give a lost child the voice he was denied. Before we begin this unbelievable, true-inspired story, tell us where you're watching from, your city, your state, or your country. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Winter pressed heavily against the mountains of western Montana, the sky a cold sheet of gray stretching over the quiet outskirts of Missoula. Frank Walker woke as he always did before dawn, before the alarm that no longer existed, before the world had the chance to disturb his silence. At 73, his joints protested every small movement, a reminder of wounds earned in a jungle halfway around the world. But pain to him was simply proof that he was still alive. He sat up in the narrow bed inside his weather-worn cabin, rubbing a hand across his stubbled jaw. His reflection in the darkened window showed a man with deep-cut wrinkles, silver hair grown unruly, and eyes like worn steel, tired but unbroken. He reached for his clothes, a thick red and black buffalo-plaid flannel jacket that had become his armor against the world, a gray thermal shirt, denim jeans faded thin shin from years of use, and a pair of brown leather boots that had seen better decades. At the foot of the bed lay his only true family, Kaiser, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat of black and storm gray. The dog's ears perked before his tail thumped once, twice against the floor. Kaiser was large, powerful, and intelligent. His stare burned golden in the half-light. Unlike most dogs, he rarely barked. He watched, waited, and warned. Frank appreciated that kind of discipline. "Morning, Frank," murmured in a gravelly voice unused to speaking. Kaiser rose in one fluid motion, stretching out his long spine before moving beside him like a silent shadow. Frank didn't talk much, not to the few townspeople who remembered his name from the VA office, not to the cashier at the lonely gas station down the road, and certainly not to strangers. People forgot quickly. They forgot what soldiers did, what soldiers lost. But Kaiser never forgot anything. That mattered more than neighbors who waved politely, but whispered once his back turned. Coffee steamed black and bitter from a dented percolator, while Kaiser crunched through his breakfast. Outside, snow clung to the pine needles like tiny glass teeth. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and oil, a comforting haze that wrapped around Frank like an old blanket. This land was quiet, finally quiet, and Frank clung to that silence with both hands. He had survived the kind of noise that melted men from the inside out. Silence was peace, or at least it was the closest thing to peace he would ever get. When breakfast ended, they stepped outside into the crisp morning air. The snow under Frank's boots crackled loud in the stillness. Kaiser led the way down the familiar deer trail, breath puffing from his muzzle in soft clouds. Frank didn't need to own the forest to feel like its guardian. He walked with a hickory stick carved smooth by his own restless hands. He checked the land every morning, fallen branches washed out creek beds, animal tracks. He said it was for safety. In truth, it gave him purpose. For 2 miles, their footsteps echoed softly, the sky just beginning to brighten. Frank felt a welcome ache in his left knee, a dull throb that helped distract from the memories that lurked behind every quiet moment. But somewhere deeper in the woods, the forest changed. The air thickened heavy with a strange dampness. Kaiser slowed. His nose twitched. Soft fur bristled down his spine. Frank's steps halted. "What is it, boy?" Kaiser didn't glance at him. Instead, the dog turned toward a sloping hollow, an untouched stretch of forest. Locals avoided without knowing why. They called it the dead zone because nothing grew there except towering old-growth trees whose branches twisted together like interlocked bones. Kaiser let out a low, vibrating whine, fear something Frank had never seen in him. Fear meant danger, Bear. Frank whispered, tightening his grip on the stick. Bears moved loud. This silence was absolute. Kaiser crept forward, but every few feet he pressed his flank against Frank's legs, as if forcing him to stay close. The deeper they walked, the darker the world became. Snow didn't reach here. Light barely did. The trees stood ancient and enormous silent sentinels guarding a secret older than the town itself. Then Kaiser stopped sharply, stiff as carved marble. His lips peeled back, revealing sharp white teeth. A growl rolled out low as distant thunder. Frank followed the dog's gaze. In the center of the clearing stood the tree. A monumental red cedar 12 feet thick twisted unnaturally, as if something unseen had wrung its trunk like wet cloth. The bark near its base bulged outward in a grotesque tumor that seemed to pulse. Frank felt his heartbeat slow, then pound faster. Something about the tree was wrong, not sick, possessed. He stepped closer, and the smell hit him. Not pine, not sap, but the scent of rust and rot copper and decay, the smell of blood dried too long under a summer sun. Black liquid oozed down the bark in sluggish trails thick as oil. It wasn't dripping, it was bleeding. Kaiser snarled, louder tail tucked, refusing to step closer. His eyes locked not on the tree, but on the shadows beneath it, where nothing moved yet something watched. Frank knelt, pressing his gloved fingers to the bark. The wood was cold, slick, alive. He narrowed his eyes and used his flashlight to pierce the gloom. There, half consumed by decades of growth, gleamed a small rectangle of painted metal olive green rusted around the edges. Military issue. Ammunition storage from the Vietnam era. His lungs tensed. His past had no business resurfacing here. He tapped the object lightly with a knuckle. The sound was dull, sturdy, buried deep. The tree had swallowed it whole. His pulse quickened. Curiosity, something he thought he'd left in 1971, flickered painfully alive. His instincts battled. Ranger training told him, observe, leave, report. War taught him questions get you killed. Age whispered, turn around, old man. Your ghosts are sleeping. But something deeper whispered back, the forest doesn't hide things without a reason. Kaiser's posture changed suddenly, panic coiling into aggression. The dog snapped at the empty air, teeth clashing violently, like clearing an invisible line. Easy, Kaiser, Frank muttered, but unease rippled through him. He hadn't felt watched like this in years. Not since the jungle. The memory flashed with perfect clarity, vines, mud, sweat. Darkness where enemies hid, just out of sight. He blinked, and the cedar was back in view, but the feeling remained. The tree stood still, yet Frank could swear the bulging wood strained outward for a fraction of a second, as if something inside was pushing to get out. His breath fogged in the cold air. Don't be stupid, he scolded himself. It's just a tree, just an old dying tree. Still, he stepped backward one careful foot after another, never breaking eye contact with the cedar. We're leaving, he whispered. His voice cracked like ice breaking on rock. Kaiser immediately retreated at his side, hackles still raised. They fled the clearing without turning back, branches grabbing at Frank's coat like skeletal fingers. Only when the silence gave way to the usual forest sounds did the dog finally relax. Frank stopped and looked toward the sky, now tinted a pale silver. He inhaled slowly, letting the cold burn his lungs. He should forget it, let the past rot where it lay. But the thought of that olive-green metal box lodged in living wood gnawed at him. A voice from a world he buried long ago seemed to whisper, "You don't leave a mystery out in the dark." And Frank Walker had never been a man to leave someone or something behind. The tree had secrets, and he would come back to rip those secrets free. As long as he and Kaiser still breathed, that box would not stay buried. Frank Walker limped through the cabin door with the storm snapping at his back, like an old enemy returning for unfinished business. The sky outside had sunk into a bruised shade of indigo, the first knife edge of a blizzard carving through the pines that fenced his lonely life. His left knee scarred and metal-pinned, since the war throbbed sharply, warning him the weather would only get worse. He gritted his teeth, setting down his gear on the table, a small handsaw, a steel chisel still smeared with dark resin, a rubber-wrapped hammer, coils of rope and weathered gauze now stained with a mix of his blood, and something that should never have come from a tree. Kaiser padded in behind him, paws silent on the cabin's wooden floor, fur-wet eyes sharp. The German shepherd shook off the snow and stayed pressed close to Frank's leg, guarding, always guarding. Frank muttered a tired thanks to the dog and shrugged out of his moss-green poncho, revealing his thick flannel jacket, blotched with blackish streaks like oil stains from a forgotten engine. The veteran stared down at his trembling, bleeding hand, an angry red puncture where the chisel had slipped while he pried the buried object free. The memory surged. The tree's resin had clung to the wound like it wanted to crawl under his skin. He washed the hand under cold water, but the copper tang smell refused to leave. As Kaiser sniffed anxiously at the injured hand, Frank gave a gruff pat to reassure him. "I've had worse," he whispered, even though his pulse told a different story. He knew fear. He had smelled death, and that black resin smelled exactly like both. But the box, that was what he couldn't tear his mind away from. It sat on the kitchen table, mud and rot dripping onto the wood beneath. It was a militarized olive green, his war's color rusted at the seams, but unmistakably crafted to endure. He hooked 2 fingers under the lid's edge and forced it open. Stale, swamp-like air puffed out thick and suffocating. The water inside was black as night and slick as tar. Carefully, he reached into the recess, and the contents emerged like artifacts wrested from time itself. A stack of baseball cards wrapped in decayed twine, faces of smiling boys in bright uniforms staring back across generations. A plastic toy compass whose needle was frozen forever, pointing at a direction no place existed. A folding buck pen knife with a deer-bone handle, beautiful craftsmanship marred by a small chip, a white crescent bite missing from one side. And at the bottom, wrapped in waxy, oil-stained paper, a small, spiral-bound notebook. The cover was scribbled with a child's uneven handwriting. "This belongs to Danny Moore, no snooping." Frank felt his throat tighten. His breath hitched as he sat heavily, Kaiser planting himself at Frank's boots, head raised as if ready to shield him from whatever the notebook held. The first pages held pencil drawings, clumsy bikes, stick figure moms, a girl with pigtails labeled Amy. There were math scores, B- circled with a sad face, and grocery lists in a kid's scrawl, milk bread, mom's medicine. Ordinary life frozen in ink. Then halfway through, the handwriting changed. What had been bold and messy turned cramped and shaking. The graphite pressed too hard, letters scarred into the page like they had been written through panic. January 10th. He took me again. I hate when he smiles. He smiles even when I cry. Frank's jaw clenched. He turned the page slowly. January 12th. I saw the knife. I took it when he got drunk. He yelled and I ran. I ran into the dark. I found a big tree with a hole. I hid the box there. My hands hurt. It's so cold. Kaiser whined low, sensing the shift in Frank's breathing. Rain hammered harder on the roof. The storm had arrived. Frank read on January 13th. I can't find the house. I see a light sometimes, but it goes away. Maybe Mom left the window on. I hope Amy is okay. I will sleep again for a little. I think tomorrow I will see the light again. Tomorrow I will go home. No more entries. Just a smear of graphite where the page bent as if the writer's hand went numb mid-stroke. Frank pressed his palm flat against the page before he even understood why. A child's final hope had been sealed inside a tree that stabbed deeper than shrapnel ever had. He leaned back, staring up at the ceiling, as if God had answers drawn between the wooden beams. "It's a grave," he whispered. His voice shook. "That damn thing is a grave." The cabin walls seemed to close in. His breath quickened. He wasn't in Montana anymore. He was back in a jungle night, 21 years old, hearing the screaming of a boy he couldn't save, Private Jack McHenry begging for help as the ground swallowed him in mud and gunfire. Frank's grip tightened until his knuckles whitened his knee, throbbing like the earth shaking under him again. He thought he left those ghosts overseas, but ghosts don't respect borders. He forced his eyes to the objects again. The knife, the compass, the cards, the journal. A boy gathering survival gear the only way he knew how, like a soldier preparing for war. A 9-year-old soldier. Frank's heartbeat slowed into cold resolve. He looked at Kaiser, whose ears perked as though he understood exactly what decision was forming in his owner's mind. "We're not leaving him there," Frank said. His voice carried command again, military authority rising from deep within rusted bones. "Not again. Not this time." But a name in the journal demanded attention: Earl Pritchard. Frank remembered him vaguely, an unkempt drifter from the old days, a tall, bony man with a drooping gray mustache and a laugh too loud for his own jokes. Town gossip said Earl drank himself stupid in bars and sometimes yelled at passing cars for being too young to deserve gasoline. People pitied him. People ignored him. But the journal's depiction, the smiling man, warped him into something monstrous. Frank pictured him towering over a terrified child, teeth bared in alcohol-stained grins. Frank shut the box with a quiet click, jaw set. Kaiser nudged his leg tail low, sensing the shift from fear to mission. Frank wrapped the journal gently in a dry cloth and placed it on the counter. He couldn't storm into town with accusations, not yet. He needed to contact someone who would care. Not the bureaucrats at the county office. Not those who dismissed him as just another old vet with trauma. Someone who saw him as Frank Walker, the man who once led men saved lives. There was only one person who fit that now, Tom Reynolds, sheriff of Missoula County. A man built like a logging truck, broad-shouldered with close-cropped brown hair and a stern mouth softened by clear, steady eyes. Tom was in his mid-40s, disciplined, reliable, the son of Frank's old platoon medic. He grew up hearing stories of Frank, not the broken veteran, but the fearless sergeant who brought wounded soldiers home under fire. Tom respected him in a way Frank struggled to respect himself. Frank limped to the radio near the window, but his hand hovered over the switch. The storm roared. The signal might fail. And if he called now without proof of the remains, the authorities might laugh him out of the station, or worse, seal off the forest before he could reach the site again. His eyes flicked to Kaiser. The dog's head tilted, golden eyes bright with unspoken readiness. The blizzard howled louder, the wind hammering the cabin walls like fists demanding surrender. But Frank Walker had never surrendered to storms, not the kind made of weather, not the kind made of memory. Tomorrow, before first light, he would return to that tree. He would bring tools to dig through frozen soil and unravel roots that had guarded secrets far too long. He would find Danny Moore. He would bring him home. Until then, he set his injured hand against Kaiser's warm fur, grounding himself. The dog leaned into him, heartbeat steady against Frank's trembling legs. "Rest up, boy," Frank whispered. "We've got work to do." And as Kaiser laid his head across his paws, Frank sat upright in the flickering lantern glow, staring at the journal of a child who died believing he would see his home again, vowing that at least in death that promise would be kept. The blizzard struck with the fury of an army long denied battle, sweeping down from the Bitterroot Mountains and swallowing the forests around Missoula in a sheet of white rage. Wind roared like a monstrous thing, hurling snow sideways, turning every branch and shadow into jagged ghosts, thrashing in the night. The storm didn't merely arrive, it invaded. Inside his small cabin, Frank Walker jolted awake to the sound of freezing rain pelting the tin roof in sharp metallic bursts. Each impact snapped him into a memory he thought he had buried somewhere deep beneath metals and silence. His eyes flew open, breath heaving, as the distant echo of rotor blades spun behind his eardrums. Whoop, whoop, whoop! And the imagined shouts of young soldiers surged into his skull like the storm itself had carried them back. The cabin blurred into thick jungle undergrowth shadows, into Viet Cong silhouettes. Private Jack McHenry's face flickered before him, smeared in mud and terror reaching out as the ground collapsed beneath him. Frank had reached for him once. He didn't reach far enough. He had always believed he was just one pull away from saving Jack. One breath too late, one scream too slow. His chest tightened painfully. Kaiser pressed his head against Frank's knee, grounding him back into the present, the cold, the storm, the reality that another boy had been left alone in the dark. Frank stared toward the window, snow beating against the glass in relentless sheets. Somewhere out there under the roots of a dying giant cedar, the remains of Danny Moore lay trapped at the mercy of this storm. If the mudslide swallowed the tree completely, the boy would be lost forever, forgotten by the world again. Frank forced air into his lungs, steadying the trembling in his legs. "I'm not leaving him behind," he said aloud. Whether to the storm, to the ghosts, or to Jack, he wasn't sure. He stood every joint creaking in protest, but stubborn resolve welded into his bones. Dressing was a ritual of protection, thermal shirt first, then the red and black flannel jacket that felt like a second skin, and finally his aging, rubberized raincoat, stiff but reliable. He wrapped a heavy rope around his waist and shoulders, cinching it tight. Tools clanked as he gathered them, a folding shovel, a crowbar, stakes, a tarp. Kaiser waited by the door, tail low, body rigid, ears pointed forward. He knew the difference between routine patrol and this, a mission that tasted like life and death. "Good boy," Frank murmured, clicking a flashlight into place. When he opened the cabin door, the wind slammed against him, trying to drive him back inside. Snow whipped into his face like burning needles, but his boots carved forward each step, defiant. Kaiser trotted beside him, his strong frame cutting a path through the drifts. The forest had transformed into a shifting labyrinth. Visibility dropped to mere feet ahead, and familiar shapes turned hostile. A fallen tree branch twisted into the shape of a crouching figure. A snow-covered boulder looked like a hulking predator ready to pounce. Frank's breath came ragged, the cold stabbing into his lungs, his knee screaming with each step. The storm stripped away time, minutes became hours, and the distance stretched endlessly, as though the dead zone itself resisted being found again. The creek that once trickled lazily now churned with violent brown water. Frank looped the rope around a sturdy tree, then around his waist, and began to cross. Halfway through, his boot slipped on a slick rock hidden beneath the torrent. His leg plunged into the freezing current, nearly dragging him under. Kaiser lunged, teeth latching onto the rope muscles, straining until Frank regained his footing. "Good boy," he rasped again, more grateful than words could ever say. His knee burned deep into the bone, but he pressed on. Death followed close tonight, but so did purpose. When they reached the clearing, the cedar waited like an injured titan about to fall, its roots no longer gripping the earth, but clawing upward in agony. The slope beneath had eroded, and the entire tree leaned toward the abyss below, just one violent gust away from collapsing into the chasm. Frank's heart thundered. There was no time. He hammered stakes into the ground, securing the rope to his waist like a lifeline. Kaiser paced anxiously, barking into the dark, as if warning invisible threats to stay back. Frank knelt near the exposed roots, working the shovel carefully, breath fogging thick in the air. Each scoop revealed more soil than scraps of rotting fabric, then a small shoe blew tiny, heartbreakingly intact beneath the grime. Frank's vision blurred for a moment, fear and sorrow and protective fury boiling into something sharper than pain. "I'm here, kid," he whispered. "I'm here." He positioned the tarp, securing it under the root system, his own back pressing into the tree trunk to hold it steady as the storm tried to wrench it free. Kaiser curled tightly against Frank's hip, sharing his body heat, a living buffer against the freezing wind. Hours passed in a slow, brutal crawl. His spine screamed, his shoulders burned, his fingers numbed despite the gloves soaked in icy mud. The smell hit him then, a faint sweetness of decay that only comes from death long buried. He swallowed hard. He had expected this, but knowing didn't dull the heartbreak. Lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the clearing in a flash of white, and for a split second, Frank saw the image of Jack, again covered in mud, eyes wide, begging him not to let go. "I won't," Frank croaked, tears hot against frozen cheeks. "Not this time." The blizzard surged, wind shoving the cedar with a violent force that sent soil and rocks tumbling into the ravine below. The rope pulled taut against Frank's chest. He pushed back, body rigid, every muscle screaming as he fought the weight of the collapsing world. Kaiser planted his paws, growling fiercely, as if the dog believed he could intimidate the storm into submission. The earth shifted again, and Frank gasped, terrified that gravity would rip the tree loose, taking them all with it. But then the pressure eased. His heartbeat slowed just enough for him to feel the trembling in his limbs. Beneath his hand, he felt more than mud now. He brushed aside soil and fabric until his glove met smooth bone, small white, heartbreakingly delicate. A child's rib fragment. A tiny wrist bone. He bowed his head. "You've waited long enough, Danny." The snow swirled around them like a shroud. Yet in that cold, suffocating chaos, Frank felt something warm spark inside him, an oath reforged in a 73-year-old heart, battered by war and regret. Danny Moore would not disappear again. Even if Frank had to hold the earth back with his own body, the boy would see daylight one final time. Kaiser nudged Frank's chin gently, and Frank smiled through tears, gripping the exposed roots harder. Around them, the storm howled like all the ghosts Frank had ever failed to save. But tonight, he wasn't failing anyone. He was keeping watch. He was making sure a child long forgotten would finally go home. And as the black resin bled slowly from the cedar trunk, dripping like ink into the snow, Frank whispered into the storm, "Not this time. I'm not letting go." The night died slowly, bleeding into morning, with a dim gray light that barely pierced the storm-battered sky. Snow lay thick over the forest floor, like a shroud muffling everything into a terrible stillness. Frank Walker could barely move his body, locked in a half-crouch beneath the weight of the tilted cedar muscles, frozen from fighting gravity and cold all night long. His breath rattled out in short, painful bursts, but his mind, the part of him that refused surrender, remained awake. Kaiser, his loyal German shepherd, stood guard with hackles raised and eyes darting across the trees as though daring the wilderness itself to come closer. Frank fumbled a gloved hand toward his radio, which had slipped into the snow sometime during the struggle. He pressed the button. His voice came out raw, scraped thin by exhaustion. "This is Frank Walker, Northern Missoula Woods, near Trail Marker 7. I found him. I found Danny Moore." He gave the message twice more before the storm of static swallowed the signal. Hours passed like slow melting ice before the crunch of heavy boots on the slope finally reached them. A beam of artificial light knifed through the fog. "Sir, hands where I can see them." The shout cracked across the clearing. Frank blinked hard, forcing the world back into focus. A young deputy, barely more than a boy, slipped and stumbled his way closer. His name tag shone in the half-light, Officer Chris Adams. Chris was maybe 22, tall but awkward in his own limbs, freckled cheeks flushed red from cold brown hair plastered to his forehead under his sheriff's department winter cap. There was kindness in his green eyes, but right now fear overwhelmed every instinct. The sight before him was a nightmare. An elderly man soaked in mud with a rope around his waist. A massive dog snarling protectively, and a skeletal fragment, and a single tiny blue sneaker emerging from the wet earth. Chris's pupils shrank, his hands trembled. Training faltered. He drew his weapon with a shaky grip. "Step back, drop the shovel." Away from the remains, Kaiser exploded into a furious roar, fangs bared, planting himself in front of Frank. Chaos teetered on a thread. A single twitch could shatter everything. Frank raised both hands, carefully, palms open. His voice, though cracked, carried command drilled into him decades ago. "Chris, look at me." The deputy's trigger finger quivered. "Don't make me, I have to, Chris," Frank repeated slower. "You're safe. The boy's safe. I'm not your threat, son." Kaiser's growl simmered low and vibrating. Frank did not take his eyes off the deputy. "Holster the gun," he murmured. "Don't make this your first regret." The young officer's throat bobbed. Seconds stretched. Finally, with a gasp like someone breaking the surface of deep water, Chris lowered the weapon. His breath came out in a shudder. "God," he whispered, wiping his face. I'm so sorry." Frank nodded once, no anger, no judgment, just a soldier who had seen fear turn good men into ghosts. Before another word could form, a deeper voice barked from above the slope. Adams' report. Snow cascaded as Sheriff Tom Reynolds strode into the clearing, barrel-chested, face square, and stern streaks of gray in his dark beard from years of carrying a town's worries on his shoulders. His navy coat strained across his broad frame. Snowflakes clung to his hair and mustache. He was in his late 40s, but responsibility had aged him beyond his years. Tom stopped dead as his gaze fell on the shoe in the ground. His features, tough as oak, softened into something aching. His eyes slid to Frank, and in them lived an unspoken history. Gratitude, trust, fear. "Frank," he said quietly, reverently, "you really found him." Tom knelt down, careful and reverent, brushing aside mud with fingers made gentle despite their strength. When Frank reached into his coat and handed over the Buck 110 knife wrapped in the oil-stained cloth, Tom's composure cracked. His hand shook sharply. I remember this, he murmured. His voice was rough gravel memory, scraping wounds long sealed. I took it off Earl Pritchard years before the boy went missing. He'd been waving it around at the Timberline bar, threatening a bartender who cut him off. Chris's jaw went slack. Wait, Earl Pritchard. The drunk who froze to death behind the feed store years ago, Tom swallowed hard. The same. He looked older, suddenly guilt creeping into his posture. He had no relatives to press charges, nobody to hold accountable. Law said I had to give the knife back. His hand squeezed the blade handle until his knuckles went white. I never voice breaking, he corrected himself. I couldn't imagine what he used it for. Silence settled thick as snowfall. Frank spoke into it, his tone a slow wound reopening. Danny stole it from him, fought back, cried his way through a winter night carrying that box, hoping he'd see home again. Tom's eyes closed, and died believing he would. The weight of a whole town's shame hung in the frozen air. Chris stepped back, wiping his face as if the wind had cut him open. Tom stood and straightened his broad shoulders as though preparing to face judgment himself. He turned to Chris with a quiet but irrefutable command. Secure the scene. Call the coroner. Bring evidence bags and a blanket. Frank lifted his chin. A blanket, no child. Tom said eyes burning should be cold anymore. Kaiser let out a soft whine that broke every heart present. Tom faced Frank, his expression carved with remorse. All these years, I've wondered what we missed. What I missed. You upheld the law. Frank said, voice firm but hollow. But sometimes the law's blind, where a man's heart sees clear. Tom pressed a hand to Frank's shoulder, a gesture of respect between two men who knew what it meant to fail and fight anyway. You did what we couldn't, and what we should have. Frank shook his head, eyes glistening beneath frosted lashes. He called out for someone to come back for him, he whispered. We're here now. The sheriff nodded, swallowing the lump rising in his throat. Snow continued to drift down gentler now, as if even the storm was bowing its head. 3 figures stood watch over the small grave beneath the dying cedar. A battered veteran, refusing to relive the sin of leaving someone behind. A sheriff who finally saw the monster he returned a weapon to. And the silent echo of a boy whose hope outlasted his breath. Together they waited, not for sunlight, not for absolution, but for the chance to carry Danny Moore home. Snowmelt trickled along the gutters of Missoula as the last breath of the storm faded into memory. The plows had done their work. Roads were cleared of the white burden, and life in town attempted to resume its rhythm. But for a handful of souls, the past had just awakened, and nothing would ever be routine again. In the quiet afternoon light, Sheriff Tom Reynolds eased his police SUV to a stop before the weather-beaten cabin on the ridge. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. From the passenger side stepped a woman who held grief like a second skin. Emily Moore, now in her early 40s, tall and slender with tired brown eyes that seemed older than the rest of her. She wore a long winter coat cinched around her thin waist, and her hair, brown, streaked with strands of silver, was tied neatly as though attempting to contain the chaos of a lifetime. Her face bore the creases of decades spent searching for hope in all the wrong places. Emily clutched her purse tight against her chest, knuckles white as she stared at the cabin ahead. Her breath hitched like she wasn't sure she deserved to be here. Tom walked around the SUV and laid a steady hand on her shoulder. He's inside, the sheriff said. Take your time. Frank Walker opened the cabin door when he heard the crunch of footsteps he'd been waiting. He stood tall despite the stiffness in his joints, the same red and black flannel jacket, hugging shoulders still broad with a soldier's posture. Kaiser damp fur, brushed clean, stayed beside him, alert yet calm ears flicking at every new sound. "Emily Moore?" Frank asked softly. She nodded. "You're Frank," she breathed. "The man who found him." Frank stepped aside and gestured her in. The cabin smelled of cedar smoke and coffee, a gentle refuge after years of tension. Emily crossed the threshold hesitantly, as though entering sacred ground. Frank guided her to the wooden table where he had laid out photocopies of Danny's journal pages, along with the baseball cards still faintly water-stained, but carefully preserved. Emily sat. Her fingers hovered just above the evidence of a life frozen in time before she dared touch a page. The first words she read struck her like a bell toll. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears welled. Frank poured her a cup of warm water, his hands surprisingly steady for a man who had battled a storm. "He was thinking of you," Frank murmured. Emily's gaze snapped to him, bewildered, disbelieving. "Me your home," Frank clarified. "The window light." He believed it was shining for him. He thought if he could reach that light, he'd be safe. "He'd be with you." Emily's shoulders collapsed under a weight she had carried since childhood. Her voice broke. "It was my fault," she choked out. I smashed his favorite toy. I told him I wished he'd go away. And he did. He went into the night. And I thought Kaiser took that moment to approach head low, as if he sensed the fracture in her heart. He nudged his muzzle against her knee. Emily looked at the dog in surprise, then in gratitude. She sank her fingers into the thick gray-black fur, and Kaiser pressed closer, warm, constant, asking for nothing. Frank watched silently. He understood that sometimes rescue arrived not through words, but through fur and patience. Emily wept into Kaiser's neck, the tears of a woman who had spent 40 years imprisoned by a lie of her own making. When the sobbing subsided into small shivers, she whispered, "Did he suffer?" Frank took a slow breath. He was brave. He held on longer than any grown man would have. And when the cold came, he was thinking of home. Emily closed her eyes, shoulders trembling. "Thank you," she said, a thank you shaped more like a prayer. Days later, clouds trembled over the forest as Frank strapped a hand-carved wooden cross to the back of his Jeep. Oak sanded smooth edges chiseled with care, and on its face, burned into the grain, was a name that had waited 40 winters for daylight. Danny Moore, 1968, 1977. Found in 2024. The dates were approximated, but the truth remained: Danny was no longer a missing child. He was a son, a brother, a life acknowledged. Emily insisted on coming. She wore a dark coat and carried a bouquet of white lilies, their petals fragile in the cold. Sheriff Tom joined them, as well expression, solemn regret, stitched into every furrow of his brow. They hiked together to the clearing near the ravine where the cedar once stood like a sentinel. It was gone now, cut down after the storm to safely recover what remained below. Only the scar of raw earth and a mound of freshly turned soil marked the place where Danny had slept alone for decades. Frank knelt first, planting the wooden cross into firm ground. He patted the earth to anchor it, then stepped back. The world seemed to hold its breath. Emily laid down the lilies. Snowflakes fluttered around her, melting on her cheeks. She spoke to the ground, not to mourn, but to deliver love long delayed. "Hi, Danny," she said. "I miss you. I always did." Kaiser sat beside her ears, bowed understanding, more than a human might expect. Tom cleared his throat, then performed a brief, shaking salute. Not official procedure, but something deeper, respect for the courage of a boy who never got to grow up. And Frank, he stood as straight as any soldier at attention. He lifted his right hand to his brow in a precise military salute. This time the honor was not for a fallen comrade from a foreign jungle. It was for a small hero of Missoula. The wind rustled through the pines, gentle, almost grateful. And for a heartbeat, Frank imagined Danny standing beside Jack McHenry in whatever comes after two boys finally free of the dark. When they turned to leave, Frank clicked on the Jeep radio for the first time in weeks. Music filled the cabin, soft, hopeful notes. Kaiser hopped into the passenger seat, tail sweeping the air. Frank gave him a little grin. "Burger in town sound good to you, partner?" Kaiser barked once, sharp and joyful. Frank chuckled, a sound rare enough that it made Tom and Emily smile. "All right then," he said as the engine started. "Today, we go home." As they pulled away down the winding path, the wooden cross stood watch in the dwindling light. Snow continued to fall, but lightly now, more like a blessing than a burden. A child's story, once buried and half forgotten, had found its ending. And the weary heart of a lonely veteran found room for peace again. In the quiet of that winter forest, a lost child finally found his way home, not through power, not through glory, but through love that never surrendered. Some might call it fate. Others might call it a miracle. And maybe it was God's gentle reminder that no soul is ever truly forgotten. Not by Him, not by the people who love us, even when we think they don't. Every single day in our own lives, there are people carrying silent battles, hidden grief, and hopes buried deep beneath the snow of time. Sometimes all they need is one light in the window, one person who refuses to give up on them. And sometimes we are called to be that light. So if this story touched your heart, let it be more than just a story. Leave a comment below, tell us where you're watching from, or send a prayer for someone who might feel lost right now. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that miracles still happen, that God still works in the quiet corners of the world, through ordinary people and loyal friends like Frank and Kaiser. And if you believe as we do that compassion can change lives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join this family of hope and faith. May God bless you. May He guide you home through every storm. And may He make you the miracle someone has been praying for.